Hello, my name is Alyssa Lovell, and I've chosen to do my presentation 2 on trade relations between the United States and Cuba. In order to give a little bit of history on the subject, the first economic embargo was placed on Cuba in 1960 by President Eisenhower, and this ended any previous relationship between the United States and Cuba. The purpose of the embargo was to try and sanction Cuba for its ties to the Soviet Union, and the embargo was not originally intended to be permanent. However, after the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy expanded the embargo by banning all U.S. exports to Cuba while also implementing strict travel restrictions in the early 1960s. Since then, the embargo has remained in place, with some presidents strengthening the embargo until Cuba becomes a democracy. However, the embargo has had little success in changing Cuba's government, although it has cost Cuba economically and has caused Cuba to become very impoverished in some cases. Under President Obama's administration, however, the U.S. began to increase foreign relations with Cuba in response to increased liberalization within the country. And Obama even visited Havana in 2016 and also eased the travel and trade restrictions, although he did not remove them completely because Congress would have to vote on the embargo in order to remove it completely. And then more recently, however, under President Trump's administration, this diplomacy between the two countries may not continue because on Friday, Trump announced that he would be partially reversing Obama's diplomatic work with Cuba. I would like to consider the relationship between the United States and Cuba with the two different perspectives on international trade, and they are mercantilism and liberalism. In some ways, this trade relationship exemplifies mercantilism because the whole purpose of the embargo originally was to use the U.S.'s economic power in order to force Cuba to change their government and their relationship with the Soviet Union. However, this hasn't really been very effective in changing Cuba's government. However, since then, the focus on Cuba has changed to one that intends to protect the U.S.'s interests and to maintain the U.S.'s economic power. The most recent example would be President Trump claiming that the diplomacy between President Obama and the government in Cuba lays the foundation for a bad deal for the U.S. because he claims that Cuba is taking the advantage in this case. However, from a liberal point of view, on the other hand, engaging in trade with Cuba would actually be a very good thing because it would be great for both economies. On the one hand, the U.S. would be able to increase exports to Cuba and build a much stronger economic surplus. And then furthermore, travel would be mutually beneficial because U.S. companies would be able to base airlines and hotels in Cuba and make more money. And then while people would be traveling to Cuba, they'd be spending money locally and help building local economies. So overall, taking a liberal approach by reducing government intervention would increase the economic efficiency of both Cuba and the United States. So what is the future of trade between the United States and Cuba? Recently, President Trump gave a speech claiming that he was going to partially reverse some of Obama's work in Cuba. Originally, before he gave the speech and was making announcements about it, it seemed that he was planning on completely reversing all of Obama's work and reverting back to the old embargo and travel restrictions. However, after he gave the speech in Miami recently, it seems that what he's planning on doing is not nearly as tough as he originally claimed. For example, he is still keeping the embassies that were established under Obama's administration open between the two countries. So there's an embassy in Havana, and then there's one in the U.S. for Cuba, and he's going to keep both of those still open. Overall, it seems that President Trump chose to come out against Cuba this week.